you believe this? My neighbor, the infamous Karen that everyone in our area knows all too well, had the audacity to run an electrical cord from her house all the way to my farm. Who would have thought she'd be bold enough to steal electricity right from under my nose? It started when I noticed my electric bill had suddenly skyrocketed for no apparent reason. I hadn't changed my usage patterns, hadn't purchased any new equipment for the farm, and certainly hadn't left lights on unnecessarily. What neighborhood are you watching this from? Drop a comment below to let me know which state you're from. I'm curious to see how widespread these Karen situations really are. Anyway, this story is about to unfold into a drama-filled saga of cunning schemes and sweet, sweet justice. Let's explore just how brazen this Karen was and how I managed to turn the tables on her. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first noticed something was off. I'd just received my monthly electric bill, and the amount nearly made me spit out my coffee. It was almost double what I normally paid, which made absolutely no sense considering I'm pretty consistent with my energy usage. I run a modest farm on the outskirts of a suburban development, the kind of place where city meets country. My property isn't under the jurisdiction of the neighborhood's homeowners association, a fact that has always irked certain residents who believe the entire zip code should conform to their standards. I've always treasured my independence from their petty rules and regulations, maintaining my farm exactly how I want it. After recovering from the initial shock of seeing that astronomical figure on my bill, I decided to investigate. Maybe there was a meter error, or perhaps something on my property was drawing excessive power without my knowledge. I grabbed my flashlight and began examining my outbuildings, checking connections, and following the power lines that ran across my property. As I walked the perimeter of my land that borders Karen's immaculately landscaped backyard, I noticed something unusual among the shrubs near the fence line. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary garden hose, partially hidden by decorative rocks and plants, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was actually an outdoor extension cord, and a heavy-duty one at that. My blood began to boil as I carefully followed its path, pushing aside branches and ornamental grasses until I confirmed my suspicions. The cord ran directly from an outdoor outlet on my barn, snaked through the fence, and disappeared into Karen's yard, where it connected to what appeared to be a newly installed water feature and landscape lighting. I couldn't believe the audacity. This woman, who had repeatedly complained about my unsightly farm equipment and the occasional animal noise, was literally stealing electricity from me. I decided to confront Karen immediately. I found her in her front yard, meticulously arranging fall decorations on her porch while wearing one of those wide-brimmed gardening hats that screamed, "I'm the queen of this neighborhood." As I approached, she gave me that fake smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I've just discovered something interesting along our property line. Care to explain why you've got an extension cord running from my barn to your yard?" Her reaction was priceless. First confusion, then shock, followed quickly by indignation. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she sputtered, her face flushing. "Are you accusing me of something?" When I invited her to come see for herself, her story suddenly changed. "Oh, that old thing? That must have been the landscaper's mistake. I told them to connect to my outdoor outlet. You know how these workers are. They don't listen, barely speak English." Her casual racism didn't surprise me, but her blatant lying did. When I made it clear I wasn't buying her explanation, Karen switched tactics instantly. "Well, if your electrical setup wasn't so haphazard and dangerous, this wouldn't have happened. You know, your entire property is an eyesore and a hazard. The HOA has been meaning to speak with you about bringing everything up to code." I had to laugh at that. "Karen, my farm isn't part of your HOA, never has been, never will be. And speaking of hazards, stealing electricity is not only illegal but dangerous. I suggest you disconnect that cord immediately and pay me for the electricity you've been using." Her face contorted with rage as she realized her intimidation tactics weren't working. "We'll just see about that," she hissed, before turning on her heel and marching back to her house, phone already in hand. I knew right then that this wasn't over. Far from it. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat or wrongdoing. She was the type to escalate. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but wonder what her angle was. Was she just trying to save a few bucks on her electric bill? Or was this some convoluted scheme to exert HOA influence over my property? Either way, I wasn't going to let it slide. I'm generally a live and let live kind of guy, but there's something about blatant theft and entitlement that really gets under my skin. Rather than immediately disconnecting the cord or reporting the theft, I decided to take a different approach. If Karen wanted to play games, I could play too, but with a strategy she wouldn't see coming. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at that inflated electric bill, a plan began to form in my mind. It would require patience and precision, but the potential payoff, teaching Karen a lesson in respect and boundaries, would be well worth it. Later that evening, as I was sitting on my porch enjoying the quiet and mentally refining my plan, I spotted movement near the property line. Squinting through the dim light, I could make out Karen's silhouette as she crept across her backyard and approached the area where the extension cord disappeared into the shrubbery. Was she going to remove the evidence of her theft? But to my surprise, she seemed to be adjusting something, possibly ensuring the connection was secure or hidden better. I grimaced, realizing that not only was she unapologetic about stealing my electricity, but she was doubling down on it. What else might she be planning that was even more audacious than this? 2 days after discovering Karen's electrical thievery, I was repairing a fence in the far corner of my property when I spotted a small procession making its way across my front yard toward the house. Leading the charge was Karen, wearing what I assumed she thought was an official-looking outfit, a blazer over dress pants, followed by an older woman I recognized as Ellen, the HOA president, and 2 other neighbors who often hung on Karen's every word. The sight would have been comical if it weren't so irritating. I put down my tools and walked to meet them, wondering what kind of circus I was about to witness. Karen had clearly wasted no time mobilizing her troops, and judging by the self-satisfied smirk on her face, she thought she had the upper hand. "Good afternoon, John," Ellen began formally, clutching a leather portfolio to her chest like it contained state secrets. I nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing, waiting for them to reveal their purpose. Karen couldn't contain herself. "We're here on official HOA business," she announced, emphasizing official, as if the word itself carried legal weight. "We've received reports of several code violations on your property that need immediate attention." I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what codes would those be exactly?" Ellen cleared her throat and opened her portfolio, pulling out a printed sheet that looked like a checklist. "According to our records, your electrical installations don't meet safety standards required by the HOA bylaws. Additionally, there are concerns about the aesthetic impact of your agricultural equipment and structures." I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "My property isn't part of your HOA jurisdiction. This farm predates your development by about 50 years, and it was specifically excluded when the surrounding lands were sold to developers." Karen's face flushed with anger. "That's not possible. All properties in this area are subject to HOA guidelines. You can't just do whatever you want." The 2 neighbors behind her nodded in unison, like programmed robots. "Actually, I can," I countered, keeping my tone measured despite my growing irritation. "I have the original deed and property documents that clearly establish my land as exempt from your association. I'd be happy to show them to you if you'd like." Ellen looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. It was becoming clear she hadn't done her homework before allowing Karen to drag her into this confrontation. "Well," she stammered, "regardless of jurisdiction, there's still the matter of community standards and neighborly consideration. Your farming activities impact the overall atmosphere of our neighborhood." I could see what was happening. They had no legal ground to stand on, so they were appealing to some vague notion of community obligation. Karen seized the opportunity to take control of the conversation. "The point is, John, you can't continue operating as if you exist in isolation. Your farm impacts our property values, those animals, that old barn, the constant machinery noise." It all detracts from what we're trying to build here, a premium living environment." The irony was too much. I gestured toward the hidden extension cord that still ran between our properties. "Speaking of operating in isolation, Karen, would you like to explain to Ellen why you've been tapping into my electricity without permission? Or shall I?" Karen's eyes widened momentarily before narrowing to slits. "That's a baseless accusation," she hissed, though I noticed she avoided making eye contact with Ellen. "If anything, your substandard electrical setup is a hazard to the entire neighborhood. We should be reporting you to the county inspector." Her deflection was impressive, I had to admit. Classic Karen behavior, turning her own wrongdoing into an accusation against someone else. Ellen, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, attempted to regain control. "Perhaps we should focus on finding a compromise here, John. While you may not technically be part of the HOA, we would appreciate your cooperation in maintaining certain standards that align with our community vision." I shook my head, feeling my patience wearing thin. I've maintained this farm the same way for the past 15 years, without issue. The only thing that's changed recently is my electric bill, which mysteriously doubled after Karen's new water feature was installed. Coincidence? I think not. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged man who I'd barely exchanged words with before, looked curiously at Karen. "You got a new water feature? I thought those weren't approved in the last HOA meeting due to water conservation concerns." Karen shot him a look that could have withered crops. "That's different. I have special dispensation due to my position on the landscaping committee." The visit concluded with vague threats from Karen about official inspections and formal complaints to county authorities, while Ellen made non-committal noises about following up on the concerns from both sides. As they walked back toward the subdivision, I could see them engaged in heated discussion, with Karen gesticulating wildly while Ellen repeatedly shook her head. I smiled to myself, knowing I'd planted a seed of doubt in their minds about Karen's integrity. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Karen had essentially declared war, and I needed reinforcements. After they disappeared from view, I pulled out my phone and called my old friend Mike, who happened to be an electrical engineer with a wicked sense of humor and his own history of HOA battles. "Hey, Mike," I said when he answered. "Got time to help me with an interesting electrical problem? It comes with a side of neighborly drama that I think you'll appreciate." As I watched the HOA delegation retreat back to their perfectly manicured lawns, I couldn't help but notice that some of the neighbors were giving Karen sidelong glances. It seemed her iron grip on the HOA might not be as secure as she believed. Perhaps there were others who had grown tired of her tyrannical approach to neighborhood governance. I made a mental note to pay more attention to these community dynamics. They might prove useful in what was shaping up to be a battle of wit. One thing was certain: if Karen thought she could intimidate me into submission or trick me into acknowledging HOA authority over my property, she had severely underestimated her opponent. I went back to repairing my fence, my mind already working on the next phase of my response. "We'll see who gets the last laugh," I muttered to myself, hammering a nail with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. Mike arrived the next afternoon in his beat-up pickup truck. Despite his casual appearance in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, Mike was one of the sharpest minds I knew, with a particular genius for electrical systems and a personal vendetta against overbearing HOAs after his own nightmare experience in his previous neighborhood. I led him to where Karen's extension cord connected to my outdoor outlet. "Well, I'll be damned," he whistled when he saw the setup. She didn't even try to hide it well. Classic entitled behavior. They don't think they need to cover their tracks because they don't believe they're doing anything wrong. After examining the connection with his multimeter, Mike confirmed my suspicions. Based on what's connected on her end, the water feature, landscape lighting, and outdoor entertainment system, I'd estimate she's drawing about 1,200 watts continuously. That adds up quick on your bill. When I explained this had likely been happening for at least 2 months, Mike's eyes gleamed with mischief. "You could just cut the cord or report her, but where's the satisfaction in that? I think Mrs. Hope needs a lesson in electrical etiquette." Over beers on my back porch, Mike outlined our plan. People like Karen are all about appearances, authority, and avoiding embarrassment. They'll happily bend rules when it suits them, but are terrified of being caught. Instead of confronting her directly again, which she would just deny, we decided to hit her where it would hurt most, her wallet and her pride. Mike, who had studied graphic design before becoming an engineer, suggested creating an official-looking HOA utility bill specifically for unauthorized power usage. We carefully crafted a document that mimicked actual HOA correspondence, complete with the correct letterhead, logo, and formatting style. After calculating her estimated usage, we settled on charging her $50. High enough to sting, but low enough that she'd likely pay it without question. The bill included line items for an unauthorized power usage fee, $35, and an administrative processing charge, $15, along with official-sounding language about maintaining the integrity of community resources. Payment instructions directed her to submit the money to the HOA office. "Do you think she'll actually fall for it?" I asked as we admired our creation. "She is on the HOA board after all." Mike shrugged. "The beauty of bureaucracy is that it's so convoluted even insiders get confused. Plus, HOAs are notorious for random fees. My guess is she'll assume it's legitimate because it looks legitimate, and because deep down she knows she's been stealing electricity." Before leaving, Mike helped me set up a discreet security camera aimed at the extension cord connection, just in case we need more evidence, he explained. He also advised sending an anonymous email to Ellen suggesting Karen might be manipulating HOA funds or rules. "Plant the seed of doubt," he recommended. "If Karen comes after you, it'll help to have the HOA president not entirely on her side." As Mike drove away, I contemplated our plan. It was perhaps a bit petty, but after dealing with Karen's entitled behavior and outright theft, it felt justified. That night I slept better than I had in weeks, looking forward to slipping our special creation into Karen's mailbox the next morning. 3 days after delivering our fabricated HOA power bill to Karen's mailbox, I was in my workshop repairing a tractor part when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. I peered through the dusty window to see not just Karen and Ellen this time, but a small entourage of about 5 HOA members marching toward my house with the determined gait of people on a mission. Karen was at the front, of course, clipboard in hand and a triumphant expression on her face that made my stomach tighten. Whatever this was about, she clearly thought she had the upper hand. I stepped outside to meet them, wiping my greasy hands on a rag and mentally preparing for another confrontation. "Well, this is quite the welcoming committee," I called out as they approached. "To what do I owe the pleasure this time?" Ellen, looking somewhat uncomfortable but resolute, spoke first. "John, we're here on official HOA business regarding multiple compliance issues that have been brought to our attention." She glanced at a document Karen thrust toward her. "We've prepared a formal notice of violations that require immediate attention." Karen couldn't contain herself, cutting in before Ellen could continue. "We've documented numerous infractions, including improper animal enclosures, unauthorized structures, and insufficient setbacks from property lines. As a community, we have standards that must be maintained, regardless of your agricultural pursuits." I took the paper Ellen extended toward me, scanning it quickly. It was a laughably comprehensive list of supposed violations, everything from the height of my barn to the color of my storage shed. Even the chicken coop was cited for creating unsightly views and potential health hazards. "I see you've been busy," I said, looking directly at Karen, whose smile widened in satisfaction. "Unfortunately, as I've explained before, my property is not subject to HOA jurisdiction. I have the original deed and property documents that explicitly exempt this farm from your association's authority." I turned to address the other members who were present, some of whom looked less certain about this confrontation than Karen and Ellen. "I'm curious, did all of you know that this farm was here long before your development was built? That it was specifically carved out as a separate entity when the surrounding land was sold to developers? Because that legal fact seems to keep getting overlooked." A couple of the neighbors exchanged glances, and one elderly gentleman in the back frowned slightly, shaking his head. Clearly not everyone had been fully informed about the situation. Karen, sensing she might be losing her audience, quickly regained control of the narrative. Legal technicalities aside, your operation impacts our entire community. Those outdated structures, the constant machinery noise, those animals, they all affect our property values and quality of life. As members of this community, we have every right to insist on certain standards. She gestured dramatically toward my barn. Just look at that electrical setup. It's not just an eyesore, it's dangerous. We've consulted with experts who confirm it doesn't meet modern safety codes. I had to stifle a laugh at the irony. Here was Karen, who had been stealing my electricity, lecturing me about electrical safety. "That's interesting, Karen," I replied calmly. "Is one of those experts the same person who helped you run an extension cord from my property to power your new water feature? Because I'd love to hear their professional opinion on the safety of that arrangement." The atmosphere shifted instantly. A few of the neighbors turned to look at Karen with confusion and surprise. One woman, whose name I thought was Barbara, spoke up. "What extension cord, Karen? What is he talking about?" Karen's face flushed red, but she recovered quickly. "This is exactly the kind of baseless accusation I warned you all about," she said, voice rising. "He's trying to distract from his own violations by making ridiculous claims." Ellen, who had remained mostly silent, gave Karen a long, measured look before turning back to me. "John, these are serious allegations on both sides. Perhaps we should address them in a more official capacity." The way she emphasized official made me wonder if she was beginning to doubt Karen's integrity. I smiled politely at Ellen. "I would welcome that. In fact, I have documentation and evidence to support my position on all counts. Do you?" Karen, clearly not expecting her authority to be questioned, especially not by the HOA president, stepped between us. "We don't need to justify ourselves to him. We represent the homeowners association and we have procedures for dealing with non-compliant properties. If he won't voluntarily address these violations, we have other options." Her voice had taken on a threatening edge that seemed to make even some of her supporters uncomfortable. I maintained my composure, though internally I was quite enjoying watching Karen dig herself deeper. "Such as?" I prompted, genuinely curious about what she thought she could do. Karen straightened her posture, attempting to look official and intimidating. "We can report you to the county for code violations, initiate legal proceedings for creating a nuisance property, and formally document how your farm negatively impacts the surrounding neighborhood. Trust me, you don't want to see what happens when the full weight of our HOA legal team gets involved." The elderly gentleman who had frowned earlier finally spoke up. "Now hold on just a minute, Karen. I've lived here since before most of these houses were built, and that farm has never been a problem. In fact, I rather enjoy seeing a piece of our community's history preserved." He turned to me with a nod. "My father used to buy corn from the original owner of this place back in the day." Karen dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "The past is irrelevant, George. We're talking about current violations and community standards." George didn't back down. "And I'm talking about respecting property rights and not overstepping our authority. If his land isn't under HOA jurisdiction, we have no business here." A murmur of agreement rippled through a couple of the other neighbors, and I could see Karen's influence beginning to fracture before my eyes. Sensing the shift in the group's dynamics, Karen escalated her threats, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on shrill. "Fine. If the HOA won't protect our community's interests, I'll handle this myself. I can and will report your unsafe electrical systems to the county inspector. They take those violations very seriously, especially when they pose a fire risk to adjacent properties. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The irony was too perfect to pass up. I smiled calmly and replied, "Speaking of electrical systems and who's dealing with whom, I believe you received a notice recently about unauthorized use of utilities. Have you addressed that yet?" Karen's eyes widened, almost imperceptibly, and for a split second I could see uncertainty flicker across her face. She recovered quickly, but not before Ellen and a few others caught her reaction. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. but her voice lacked its previous conviction. As the group prepared to leave, I called out, "Oh, by the way, I prepared some documentation of my own that you might find interesting. It seems only fair that if you're keeping records on me, I should do the same." I held up a folder containing printouts of the security camera footage showing Karen's extension cord connected to my outlet, along with copies of my electric bills showing the suspicious increase. "Your utility bill is ready when you are, Karen. I hope you don't mind the special assessment for unauthorized usage. The HOA does have to maintain certain standards after all." Karen stared at me, her face a mask of confusion mixed with dawning horror as she realized what I was referring to. The other neighbors looked between us, clearly sensing they were missing something significant. Karen grabbed Ellen's arm and practically dragged her away, the others following behind with varying expressions of confusion and curiosity. As they retreated down my driveway, I could see Karen gesticulating wildly, while Ellen repeatedly shook her head. Phase 2 of our plan was unfolding perfectly, and I couldn't wait to see what happened next. A week passed with no further confrontations from Karen or the HOA delegation, though I occasionally caught glimpses of her watching my property from her upstairs window, her silhouette visible through the curtains. During this time, Mike had sent a carefully worded anonymous email to Ellen, expressing concerns from a HOA member about potential misuse of authority and selective enforcement of rules. We had no way of knowing how Ellen had received this information, but the lack of further group visits suggested that perhaps Karen's influence was being questioned. Throughout this period, the extension cord remained connected, still drawing power from my outlet to Karen's yard features. I was tempted to disconnect it myself, but Mike had convinced me to let our plan play out fully. "Patience," he had advised over the phone when I updated him. "The longer she keeps stealing your electricity while having received that bill, the more damning it becomes." The fake HOA power bill we had created was a masterpiece of deception, though I say that with a mix of pride and slight guilt. The heavy cream-colored paper bore an exact replica of the HOA letterhead, complete with their pretentious faux heraldic logo. The bill detailed unauthorized utility usage fees of $35 and an administrative processing charge of $15 for a total of $50. The language was a perfect imitation of bureaucratic jargon, explaining that regular monitoring of community resources has identified unauthorized connection to and usage of electrical services outside the approved residential grid system. It cited fictional HOA bylaw sections and included stern warnings about escalating penalties for continued violations. A payment stub at the bottom directed payment to be submitted to the HOA office by the 15th of the month, with an ominous note that for failure to remit payment may result in additional assessments and potential review by the HOA Compliance Committee. The psychology behind our creation was simple but effective. The amount was carefully calibrated. $50 was significant enough to be annoying, but not so large that Karen would immediately contest it. It was in the range of typical HOA nuisance fees, the kind most homeowners grumble about but ultimately pay to avoid headaches. For someone like Karen, who clearly valued her standing in the HOA and used it as a source of power, the prospect of being labeled non-compliant or a rule breaker would be particularly uncomfortable. We were betting that she would pay the bill quickly and quietly rather than risk any scrutiny that might expose her electrical theft or damage her authority. After all, if she inquired too aggressively about this specific charge, someone might start asking why she was being billed for unauthorized electrical usage in the first place. On the morning of the 15th, the payment deadline we had specified, Mike called me with exciting news. "You're not going to believe this," he said, barely containing his laughter. "I just got off the phone with my buddy who works at the bank where the HOA has its accounts. Karen came in yesterday and deposited $50 cash into the HOA account. She actually paid the fake bill." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "Are you serious? She didn't question it or try to contest it?" Mike's laughter echoed through the phone. "Nope. Apparently she looked pretty tense when she did it too. Kept glancing around like she was worried someone was watching her. My buddy didn't think much of it until I told him about our little scheme. He said she specifically referenced the invoice number we created when making the deposit. I couldn't believe it had worked so perfectly. Karen had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. She must have been so worried about being exposed as an electricity thief that she paid without question, probably hoping the whole matter would simply go away. This is priceless, I told Mike. She's literally paying me back for the electricity she stole, and she doesn't even realize it. Mike chuckled. Well, technically she's paying the HOA, not you directly, but yeah, the irony is beautiful. The queen of HOA enforcement gets a taste of her own medicine. I considered this. We should find a way to let Ellen know about this mysterious payment that doesn't appear in the official HOA ledger. I bet Karen didn't tell anyone she was making this deposit. Mike hummed thoughtfully. Leave that to me. I think another anonymous email might be in order. This time with some very specific details about unauthorized financial transactions. Over the next few days, we continued our behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Mike sent the email to Ellen, and I strategically mentioned the HOA utility assessment to another neighbor, Linda, who I knew was both friendly with Ellen and notorious for spreading neighborhood gossip. I casually showed her a copy of the bill while we chatted over the fence, expressing mild confusion about receiving it. I thought my property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, I said innocently, but Karen seemed very insistent when she hand-delivered this. Do you know anything about new utility monitoring? Linda's eyes widened with interest as she examined the document. I haven't heard anything about this, and I attend all the meetings. How curious that Karen would be involved in billing issues. That's usually Ellen's department. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she handed the paper back to me. May I take a picture? I'd like to ask Ellen about this. I agreed readily, suppressing a smile as she snapped a photo with her phone. The gossip mill was now officially in motion. Meanwhile, the security camera Mike had installed captured Karen making several nervous visits to the area where her extension cord connected to my outlet. She appeared to be checking that the connection was still secure while also trying to better conceal it among the shrubbery. At one point, she even added some fake decorative rocks to further disguise the cord. Her actions clearly indicated guilty knowledge. She knew she was stealing electricity, but had no intention of stopping. The combination of her continued theft and her payment of our fake bill created the perfect storm of evidence against her. We now had proof that she was aware of what she was doing, understood it was wrong, and was willing to pay to keep it quiet rather than simply disconnect and apologize. Every day that passed with the cord still connected strengthened our position for the inevitable confrontation that was to come. I knew the bubble would eventually burst. Karen would either discover the bill was fake or someone from the HOA would inform her that no such fee existed. But by then it would be too late. She had already implicated herself by paying the bill, continuing the electrical theft, and attempting to cover her trap. As Mike had predicted, Karen had walked right into our trap, and now all we had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. That moment came sooner than expected when Linda called me the following evening, her voice bubbling with excitement. "John, you won't believe this," she exclaimed as soon as I answered. Ellen confronted Karen about the mysterious payment, and Karen completely fell apart. She started making wild accusations about you trying to frame her, but when Ellen showed her the bank receipt with Karen's signature, she couldn't deny it anymore. Ellen asked why she would pay a bill specifically for unauthorized utility usage if she wasn't actually using unauthorized utilities. According to Linda, Karen stormed out of the meeting in tears, threatening to sue everyone from me to the HOA itself. The whole neighborhood is buzzing. I thanked Linda for the information and hung up, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Karen had walked right into our trap, but now that she was cornered, she was likely to become even more dangerous. I called Mike immediately to update him. "Well," he said after I relayed Linda's account of the meeting, "looks like the cat's out of the bag. Expect Hurricane Karen to make landfall at your farm very soon." His prediction couldn't have been more accurate. The next morning, I spotted Karen's SUV barreling down my driveway at an alarming speed, coming to an abrupt stop that sent gravel flying. The battle was about to enter its final phase, and I was ready. The morning after Linda's revealing phone call about the emergency HOA meeting, I was enjoying a peaceful cup of coffee on my front porch when Karen stormed up my driveway. Her face was flushed with anger as she brandished our fake HOA power bill. "You!" she shouted. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Creating fake HOA documents? That's fraud, you know. Fraud!" I remained composed, knowing my calmness would only infuriate her more. "Good morning to you too, Karen. Lovely day, isn't it?" Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't play innocent. Ellen confirmed this is completely fabricated. There is no such thing as an unauthorized utility usage fee in our HOA bylaw." "How interesting," I replied. "Yet you paid it anyway. In cash, I understand. Now, why would you do that if you weren't using unauthorized utilities?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice again. "That's completely irrelevant. You forged official documents. That's illegal, and I'm going to make sure you face consequences." I stood slowly. "Before throwing around accusations of illegality, perhaps we should discuss the extension cord that's still running from my outlet to your yard fixtures. Last time I checked, theft of services is also illegal." Her eyes darted briefly toward where the cord lay hidden, an unconscious tell that confirmed her guilt. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she insisted, though her voice trembled slightly. Over the next week, Karen launched a systematic campaign against me. She organized documentation visits with loyal HOA members, walking the perimeter of my property, taking photos and notes of supposed violations. When these intimidation tactics failed, she escalated to filing a formal complaint with the county zoning office, claiming I was operating agricultural facilities in a residential zone. Fortunately, my permits and documentation were in order, proving my farm had been grandfathered in when the development was built. The county inspector who visited was actually quite sympathetic. "Get these complaints all the time when developments encroach on existing farms," he confided while approving my paperwork. Karen was visibly furious when she saw him laughing and shaking my hand as he left. Not stopping there, Karen discovered Mike's involvement and targeted him as well, sending him a threatening letter full of legal jargon about conspiracy to defraud and harassment of an HOA official. Mike found it more amusing than concerning. "This is the most entertainment I've had in years," he told me. "Besides, I've dealt with bigger HOA bullies before. If she wants to play legal hardball, she'll lose badly." Despite our outward confidence, Karen's persistence was becoming troubling. She seemed willing to go to extraordinary lengths rather than simply admitting wrongdoing. I caught her trespassing one evening, openly filming my property with her phone. "Building code violations," she announced loudly. "Improper animal containment. All going in my report. They'll shut you down for good." When I reminded her she was trespassing and suggested she remove her illegal electrical connection, she became defiant. "I've already spoken with my attorney. What you did is criminal fraud." I couldn't help smiling. "And did you explain to this attorney why you paid a bill you now claim was obviously fake? Or mention the extension cord still connected to my outlet?" The following morning, a thick envelope arrived bearing a law firm's logo. Inside was a cease and desist letter demanding I stop harassing Karen through fraudulent documents, defamatory statements, and intrusive surveillance. It demanded I remove all cameras, cease making false accusations of theft, and prepare to pay damages for emotional distress and reputational harm. A quick internet search revealed no attorney by the name on the letterhead worked at the firm, suggesting Karen had fabricated the entire document. That evening, watching the sunset over my farm, I decided it was time to end this completely. I would contact Ellen directly and lay out everything: the electrical theft, the fake bill, Karen's escalating behavior, hoping to resolve this reasonably before involving actual authorities. As I turned to go inside, I noticed an unfamiliar car pulling up to Karen's house. A man in a suit stepped out, and handed her a briefcase. After their brief conversation, he departed, and Karen stood on her porch with a smug smile directed my way. Whatever she was planning, the next move was hers. 2 days after the mysterious visitor delivered his briefcase to Karen, I received an official notice to appear for a mediation hearing with the county's Community Dispute Resolution Service. Karen had filed a formal complaint claiming I had engaged in harassment, created fraudulent documents, made false accusations, and violated HOA regulations. I immediately called Mike, who arrived at my farm within the hour with beer and determination. "So she's actually going through with it," he said, settling into a chair at my kitchen table. "I'm almost impressed by her commitment to doubling down instead of just admitting she stole your electricity." We spent the evening organizing our evidence. Security camera footage of Karen's extension cord, my increased electricity bills, photographs of her yard features powered by my electricity, and documentation proving my property's exemption from HOA jurisdiction. We need to be ready to explain why we created the fake bill as a way to prove she was knowingly stealing electricity, not as an attempt to defraud her, Mike advised. We debated whether to hire an attorney but decided that, for a mediation hearing, we could represent ourselves adequately. The mediation was scheduled at the County Administrative Building on Wednesday morning. When I arrived, Karen was already there with a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was her attorney. She wore her official business outfit, blazer, knee-length skirt, and a pearl necklace she kept adjusting nervously. The mediator, a retired judge named Harold Fleming, was a no-nonsense older gentleman who explained that each side would present their case, he would ask questions, and then guide us toward a resolution. Karen's attorney, Richard Dawson, presented first. "My client has been subjected to a campaign of harassment culminating in Mr. Stevens creating fraudulent HOA documents to extort money from her." He placed our fake bill on the table as Karen nodded emphatically. "He's been hostile ever since I joined the HOA board. His property is an eyesore that devalues our neighborhood, and when I tried to enforce community standards, he resorted to these underhanded tactics." When it was my turn, I addressed the mediator directly. "What they've omitted is why this document was created. For months, Mrs. Wilson has been stealing electricity from my property by running an extension cord from my outdoor outlet to power features in her yard." I presented our evidence, the security footage, electric bills showing the usage spike, and photos of the disguised connection. The bill was a test, one that Mrs. Wilson failed. If she wasn't stealing electricity, why would she pay a bill specifically for unauthorized utility usage? Karen's face flushed as Judge Fleming examined our evidence. "That's completely fabricated," she stammered. "They've manipulated those photos. Even if there was a cord, it could have been placed by anyone, landscapers, children, anyone. The point is, they created fraudulent documents." Her attorney added that my property should be subject to HOA regulations, despite my claims otherwise. I produced my property deed and the original development plans. As these documents show, my farm was specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction when the surrounding development was built. Judge Fleming examined these with interest while Karen's attorney tried to argue that community standards transcend technical boundaries, an argument the judge dismissed with a raised hand. The turning point came when Ellen arrived as a witness. Karen initially looked triumphant, clearly expecting the HOA president to support her. Instead, Ellen confirmed 3 critical facts. My property was indeed exempt from HOA jurisdiction. The HOA never created or authorized the bill Karen received, and they had no record of what the $50 cash Karen deposited was for. Ellen continued, "At a recent board meeting, concerns were raised about Mrs. Wilson's conduct as an HOA member. There have been allegations of selective enforcement, intimidation of residents, and unauthorized actions taken in the HOA's name. The board has voted to suspend her position pending review." The room fell silent. Karen's attorney shifted uncomfortably while Karen struggled to maintain composure. Judge Fleming looked directly at Karen. "Mrs. Wilson, did you connect an extension cord from Mr. Stevens' outlet to your yard?" After fidgeting with her necklace and glancing at her attorney, who avoided eye contact, Karen finally admitted in a barely audible voice, "It was just temporary. For a garden party. The outlet on my side wasn't working, and I meant to disconnect it afterward. I simply forgot." She quickly added, "But that doesn't justify their fake bill. That was fraud." Mike acknowledged creating the document but explained it was a test to confirm our suspicions, not fraud. If she wasn't guilty, she would have questioned the bill immediately instead of quietly paying it. Karen jumped up, pointing at Mike. "So you admit creating a fake document with the HOA logo? That's forgery." Judge Fleming silenced her with a raised hand. While creating that document was ill-advised, the more serious issue is the theft of services, which you've now admitted to. After 3 hours, Judge Fleming reached his conclusions. My property was indeed exempt from HOA jurisdiction, Karen had knowingly stolen electricity, and while our fake bill was inappropriate, it didn't constitute criminal fraud, given the context and lack of financial harm, since the money went to the HOA account, not our pockets. The resolution required Karen to reimburse me for the estimated electricity costs, pay an administrative fee to the county, and immediately remove the extension cord. In return, I would not pursue further action regarding the theft, and both parties would cease all harassment and surveillance of each other's properties. As we left the conference room, Karen hurried past without eye contact, her defeated attorney trailing behind. Ellen paused to speak with me. "I've always thought your farm adds character to our neighborhood. Not everyone shares Karen's zealous approach to enforcement. The board will be reviewing her conduct more thoroughly. She'll have more to worry about than extension cords for a while." Mike clapped me on the shoulder as we walked to the parking lot. "Well, that went better than expected. Think Karen learned her lesson?" I watched her car speed away, tires squealing slightly. "Maybe, maybe not, but at least now she knows she can't bully me without consequences." In the weeks following the mediation hearing, an uneasy peace settled over the neighborhood. Karen disconnected the extension cord late that night. My security camera caught her skulking around in darkness, yanking it free and hurriedly concealing it beneath her jacket as she retreated to her property. She also delivered a check for the electricity costs, leaving it in my mailbox without a note. The amount was slightly higher than we had calculated, likely her way of closing the matter definitively without having to interact with me directly. The repercussions for Karen extended well beyond our dispute. Ellen followed through on reviewing Karen's conduct with the HOA board, resulting in Karen being permanently removed from her position. Linda's neighborhood grapevine revealed the official reason was misconduct inconsistent with the values and procedures of the association. Once board members began investigating, they discovered numerous instances where Karen had enforced rules selectively, used HOA resources for personal benefit, and intimidated residents who opposed her. My fake bill incident had simply been the thread that, once pulled, unraveled her entire reign of HOA power. Karen's fall from grace manifested in a complete personality transformation, not toward humility but rather into seething resentment. When she finally re-emerged after days of seclusion, she would walk her dog past my property with her head held high, refusing to acknowledge my existence. During our rare encounters at local businesses, she would abruptly change direction or pretend to be engrossed in her phone to avoid interaction. "You know what the best part is?" Mike remarked during one of our now regular Friday evening porch sessions. "She did this to herself at every step. All she had to do was disconnect that cord when you first confronted her, maybe apologize, and that would have been the end of it. Instead, she doubled down repeatedly until she self-destructed." I had to agree. Karen's inability to admit wrongdoing and her need to maintain her facade of authority had been her undoing. The $50 fake bill was just the catalyst. She was so convinced of her own immunity that she couldn't see the trap until it was too late. My relationships with other neighbors improved significantly after the incident. Many residents, it turned out, actually appreciated having a small farm nearby, especially when I began offering fresh eggs and produce at a modest stand on weekends. Even some of Karen's former allies became regular customers. 1 month after the mediation, I received an invitation from a county-wide Sustainable Agriculture Association to feature my farm in their annual tour. Karen's attempts to shut me down had, ironically, given my farm positive publicity within the broader community. During the agricultural tour, Ellen approached me with several other HOA board members. "We've been thinking," she mentioned, examining a basket of tomatoes, "that the HOA might benefit from embracing your farm's unique character rather than fighting against it. Would you be interested in consulting on a community garden project we're considering?" As we discussed this possibility, I spotted Karen watching from a distance. Our eyes met briefly before she quickly turned and walked away. I realized I no longer cared about her opinion. She had lost both the electricity she'd stolen and her neighborhood influence, revealing her true character to everyone in the process. That evening, as the last visitors departed, Mike joined me on the porch with 2 glasses and a bottle of good whiskey. "To justice served," he toasted. I raised my glass in return. "And to $50 well spent." We clinked glasses, reflecting on how a simple extension cord had triggered a chain of events that ultimately strengthened my position in the community while exposing Karen's true nature. So there you have it, friends, the full story of how my HOA Karen plugged her house into my farm's electricity, and how a fake $50 power bill became the catalyst for her downfall. If you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors or HOA troubles, I hope this tale brought you some vicarious satisfaction. Remember, sometimes justice comes not from fighting fire with fire, but from giving someone just enough rope to hang themselves. Keep an eye out for those extension cords. Stand your ground when you're in the right, and never underestimate the power of a well-designed fake bill. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own HOA nightmare tales in the comments below.